Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of AI Would Agree. Apologies, it's been a couple of weeks since we've been on. We've had some unfortunate circumstances that have meant we've kind of had to postpone a couple of guests, but I'm sure we'll circle back around to them again in the near future. In the meantime, today, as per usual intro, Steve, who's my guest today, probably needs very little introduction. He's quite well known in the contact center space, I suspect. And the theme for today's show is around compliance. Not traditionally the most exciting topic in the world, Steve. Am I right?
No, they've all gone.
Everybody's gone. That's it. We're bored now. But like exactly as the quote that I used in the synopsis for the episode, right? If you think compliance is expensive, you should try non-compliance. Quite a famous quote, but it still holds true to most day-to-day examples. We get started on the main thrust of the show, Steve. How did you get excited? How did you get involved in the exciting world of compliance in the first place? Did you?
Yeah.
It's not
I thought
something
you might ask me that. No. So I think I've spent 25 years, like most sensible people, dodging compliance and regulation at every possible opportunity. And I still am, but was on the DMA Contact Center Council. And Neris Caulfield, who a lot of people know, was the chair. And the person who looked after regulation and compliance left. And she said, right, I want you to do that. And I said, I want to do that. It's boring. And she said, no, you're going to have to do it. So we had an argument, and she won, as usual. So I picked up regulation and compliance. So I didn't want to do it, thought it was boring. But I actually do find it quite interesting. I have to admit, probably picked it up at an interesting time when GDPR was coming over the horizon and the sky was going to fall in and everybody was panicking. And there's a few Ofcom regulation changes at the same time. And I got quite into it, but very much from a customer perspective. I'm not a compliance expert. I don't want to be a compliance person. I would ideally want to be the person who says, I understand the customer world. I understand you people, but I'll try and help you understand compliance. That's the ambition.
It's a different take to what most people would expect you to come on and say, and quite an honest and transparent view. So appreciate the candor with it. It's interesting because I remember back a few years ago when I was working in retail and I was working in a regional capacity, and I shared the office with the guy who made most of the rules for the region and the guy who was responsible for auditing most of the rules for the region. And I sat on the audit team, but it was funny because one side of the desk you had the guy sat there saying, I don't make the rules, I just follow them. And the other guy sat on the rules there, the other side sat on the desk said, I don't follow the rules, I just make them. So very much the two halves of the same coin. It's an interesting few months. But I guess from your perspective, there's a lot of sort of misconceptions around what is and what isn't compliance. But where does, in terms of following rules and understanding things like GDPR and things like that, where are you seeing the biggest interest and focus just now with where things have gone?
I think what I'm seeing is something that didn't look like it was going to happen, which is a kind of convergence of different concerns coalescing around the same sort of thing. So, when the sky was going to fall in because of GDPR and a lot of people made some ill thought out decisions, it just felt like, and now what? And now there's this thing. And I think what we've maybe collectively learned over the last 2 or 3 years, as life has got a bit more challenging in different ways, is notions around, looking after your staff, about vulnerability, staff vulnerability, customer vulnerability, the rise of fraud, the rising of scams, be they offline or digital. All those things are kind of coalescing to a sort of level where you can make some changes that don't just satisfy one narrow set of regulators or one narrow set of rules. There's actually a broad benefit to be had from them. I don't think glib. That's not always the case at all. But I think that's kind of what's happening. And, again, if you want a very honest answer, because there are occasions you get paid for doing this stuff, if you're going to spend some money on anything to do with, certainly on the data side, I'd spend it on information security, cyber security, because the cyber breach is what gets you big fines and loads of lousy negative publicity. And I think things like information security is another area of coalescence. If you can secure and manage and understand your data, you make your frontline advisors' lives more simple, more manageable. You reduce your risk profile. You diminish the chances of a data breach. So, yeah, to some extent, I think that's what's going on. It's kind of coalescence rather than some new thing that people are focused on, I think.
Yeah, I guess for the longest time, everybody kind of beat all their employees up over GDPR in anticipation, and some went to an extreme that others didn't. And I think now that the dust's settled, it's not quite the horrendous beast that we were led to expect from it. But at the same time, still see so many businesses that just really still don't understand the fundamentals of it. I mean, I guess for me, like there is a lot of conflict between, you've got like the HMRC, HR departments, for example, saying, "Oh, we must keep all these records for as long as possible because we need to be able to prove X, Y, and Z." And then you've got the conflict of the GDPR saying, "But you need to get rid of them at the earliest opportunity." So where's the balance, Steve? Is that kind of what you were implying before in terms of find that middle ground?
I think it's exactly that. It's finding middle ground because, and I could be wrong, I'd love to be contradicted, but I don't see anywhere that nicely laid out hierarchy that tells you, around data, what do you need to keep, what you're allowed to get rid of, for what reasons. And I think that's where, like most things in life, just do a kind of basic risk analysis. Who should you be most afraid of? Well, I'd say I'd be more afraid of HMRC than I would be ICO. So HMRC say keep stuff for 7 years, keep it for 7 years. But HMRC probably don't need to know rafts of personal data that's linked towards elements of your financial records or even your employment records. So you can minimize as you go. But I just think it's just, do a risk analysis. Who are you most afraid of? Like most things in life, work from fear first. And you're right. And on the surface, I don't think the various regulators say, okay, they take precedence on this, then listen to us, then listen to them. Doesn't tend to be how they do things, which is why occasionally you need to take a step back and just have a little think about it, really, which people probably always did. But I think, again, the GDPR factor causes a bit of rubber in the headlights for some people.
Yeah. So I guess to your point, it's not quite just all about the regulators, right? Which is what everybody worries about. Everybody just thinks about the regulators, but actually, maybe we should be considering the other parts of our business process and business world that makes things go around, right? Doing things for the right reasons, not just because you have to.
Yeah. Because that's I guess that's the other second most well-known quote about compliance, isn't it? Compliance is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. And that for me, sometimes with my personality type, that always works for me. But I think then the challenge is, you're right. For most organizations, particularly not if you're not in the regulated sector, the regulators aren't that interested in you, and the odds of getting found out are vanishingly slow. I worked out the run up to GDPR. Admittedly, it was illegal, but I think if every business in the country gave me £100, I could set up an insurance scheme which would guarantee pay off any conceivable GDPR fines, and I'd make 20 million quid profit a year. But in fact, that's illegal. But yeah, for most people, just in case you get the idea, I did it first, you can't do it. For most people, they're not really going to worry about the regulator. They're going to worry firstly about consumers. So again, if you've got a data breach, if you've got 2 million agreed customers, that's a bigger problem for you really than maybe a £2 million fine for the ICO. But the other group, I think you really need to think about is your stakeholders. So most of us in businesses that are kind of customer focused, particularly those that are service focused, it's a very complicated world. We've got suppliers, we've got clients, there's lots of interrelationships. And a lot of us understand compliance or are made aware of our regulatory requirements, not from the regulator, but from a client or a supplier who says, you have to do this. Are you aware of that? Do you comply with the other? That, for most of us, is when a lot of this thing, comes to us. There might be some internal process that highlights it, but a lot of times it's because you're trying to do something new or different, or you've started a new business relationship and they come to you with their raft of requirements, which, just was quite rare 20, 30 years ago. Now, everybody needs you to evidence everything. And for a lot of organizations is when they either become compliant or need to look like they're compliant, which is not always the same thing. But if you look like they're compliant, you're probably halfway there.
Yeah, it's fair. I mean, guess one of the interesting dilemmas that I've seen recently is around, I've spoken quite a bit with other tech suppliers in the vulnerable customer space, and one of the things that we kind of all agree on is that generally it's a good idea for everybody to be able to be on a level playing field. And if you're kind of vulnerable or classified as vulnerable with one business, it should be fairly easy to access that information within reason from another business in order to support you and do it for the right reason. And there's a lot of considerations to take place there in terms of ethical and moral, aside from the GDPR. So I see things like the vulnerability registration service, which is a great idea. And I know, I've spoken with Helen Lorden a couple of times. But one of their massive frustrations is around kind of, I guess, not so much those conversations, but people utilizing GDPR almost as a tool to say, oh, actually, we can't do that because GDPR says we can't. And in actual fact, sometimes it just boils down to your IT team's just really busy. And it's convenient because they're generally the keepers of GDPR and nobody else truly understands it in the business enough to push back and say, actually, we can do this or we can't do that. Is that something that you've experienced a lot?
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I think people like VRS are really interesting, aren't they? Because that's almost a kind of ground up approach to, how do we help people in the world we're in? And that's the kind of first line of defense. The false conservatism, if you like, doesn't want to do anything. Is, I can't do that because of GDPR. And you hear that all the time. Can't do that because of GDPR. You really can't. Which is not to say that every time somebody cites GDPR, it's not true, but it's probably not evidence that somebody actually thought through, what's the risk benefit? Can I justify it? And I think, again, no regulator's written this down, but one of the sort of things I can't remember who said it, is, when you look at GDPR things, your starting point should be what would a reasonable person reasonably expect? And I think sometimes what do they call it? Because the GDPR is based on an unreasonable person thinking of an excuse to have a go at an organization. And there's obviously this, there's a massive societal benefit in not just recognizing vulnerability, because I go to lots of organizations that do the best and go, look to put the sort of vulnerable tick on somebody, digitally speaking. But, what are you going to do about that? How can you help people? And, most of these things, it's a compounding effect, isn't it? If you're displaying vulnerability, you're probably displaying vulnerability in, 50 different commercial relationships and relationship public sector bodies. And it'd be great to be able to, get some alignment information. And people are less fussed about it if it's, in the old days, I guess people were less fussed because it was more like physical location and addresses and stuff. But, vulnerability can be exploited so much more easily digitally. So there is a big push. But again, we could probably do with more governmental support for those initiatives as well. But yeah, I think you're right. GDPR is just one of the many lists of excuses, which is quite handy to come out because most people can't bother to argue with it. Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not having a discussion about GDPR.
Yeah.
As you are.
And it's not something you want to seem to be publicly arguing about either. It's kind of like everybody has quite a black and white view about what GDPR is, and it's very polarizing for various reasons. I remember an interesting conversation that kind of Jimmy, our CEO, was talking about in terms of we're trying to offer next best action for some customers. And it was about how can we support those customers and what's the right product for them. And the business's pushback was, well, what right does your technology have to make decisions for our customers or for the customers themselves? And it would have been very easy to just swallow that and go, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, we'll just, and like Jimmy being, Jimmy, kind of pushed back and said, but your agents are making choices. So what right do they have to make choices based on the limited information that they've got at that point on the call where they haven't got all the information from the CRM, haven't got all the demographics information, haven't got big data sat behind it or whatever, or vulnerability toolkits or whatever. They're making a decision based on their own commission structure, their own time, their own preferences, not always taking into account the customer. So there's always that kind of, to your point, common sense element of GDPR, which often gets left behind because common sense isn't always prevalent in every conversation, even if we think it is. And that goes for everyone, right? We all have days where we don't apply common sense because it suits us. it's interesting to see some of the, I think everybody needs somebody who can sit on the fence within their business and play devil's advocate around these things and ask the hard questions rather than just going with the status quo of let's just stay safe and not do anything. Because sometimes, to your point around societal benefit, right? Sometimes the benefits far outweigh the problems caused. So can we find a way to mitigate those problems for the sake of achieving the benefit? But yeah, I think you're right. And I think that kind of goes back to something else that we were talking about before around kind of should compliance just be left with the experts that understand it? Because, does that facilitate the ease of use for your average person? And does it make the right decisions for the business? Or what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll be honest, I've not been an employee in a big organization for probably pushing 20 years, but I've got a very distinct memory not long before the 2008 crash of working for a retail bank. And we had lots of people who worked in the risk department who worked about with clipboards, and I never quite knew what they did. And I'm quite sure they didn't see the crash coming. But they had really good clipboards and RAG scorings, but no grasp of the big picture. And I think he's got the cases recently. One, to be fair, is, and it was Ofcom, where they're looking at EE and Sky, both for similar reasons. I think Sky, they've been found at fault. EE, they've started an investigation. So, I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but I can guess what they might be. That Ofcom's got some quite strict rules about when you roll over a contract, you make it clear to people on what basis they're in effect re-signing up to. And, that's a regulated industry. EA and Sky have quite a lot of people. I imagine they've got quite a lot of people working in compliance, the same way that Amex have literally hundreds of people globally working in compliance. But that didn't mean that Amex didn't get fined for sending marketing email in the guise of a service email to the whole base, it would opt out of marketing. That's it, GDPR mistake. Or that EA and Sky didn't change the wording of their renewal notices to reflect what Ofcom wanted. And you're like, well, somebody must have known. It's not like a big secret. And all three are in regulated industries. And definitely got people in compliance who knew about that stuff. But either they weren't telling anybody, which seems unlikely, or those internal communications just didn't work. Word didn't get out. People operationally didn't know or ignored them or something. I don't know what went wrong. Something went wrong. And I think it might be, I guess, from my recollections of when I had a proper job, that it's just easier to zone it out. And actually, it becomes your problem. If you're an expert, your profession is compliance, well, you sort it out because that's not my profession.
Yeah.
And that kind of concerns me a little bit, like, it's a different conversation. Well, there's anything left in the audience now. I'm always a little bit skeptical of the professionalization of customer experience. I'm not saying people don't need to be trained and skilled and we can all do with more knowledge, but just because you got a certificate, that makes me a bit nervous. Does that mean that only people who've got certificates have a view on customer experience? Well, hopefully everybody's got a view and everybody's got a stake in it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a different issue and it's not about compliance. But I think
it isn't, but it's really fair. And I think, that's one of the reasons why your world and my world intersect is because one of the things we're really passionate about is getting people back to doing what it is that they're supposed to be doing as opposed to all the mundane stuff. And, utilizing technology to kind of get rid of some of that mundane stuff. That, again, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be somebody who's aware of what's going on and keeping an eye on that, make sure that actually it doesn't impact people too much. Or, being able to kind of automate a certain amount of your compliance on your QA for a contact center, for example. Well, it doesn't mean that no compliance gets done. You can do away with your QA team because that's brilliant. What it actually means is your QA team, as they stand, can now get about looking at much more in-depth conversations and getting across more of the conversations that you previously would. That's the key to it. Yeah, time and again, I see people kind of, and it's natural, right? Like I get it. You want to have some commercial wins out of deploying the technology, so it's tempting to get rid of some people. Actually, think about it in a growth capacity. As we grow, we probably don't need as many people going forward. But right now, let's do a really good job of QA so that we can turn it into a contact center that delivers value rather than cost.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, it's all about value and outcomes, and you don't deliver either of those by checking whether I used a certain phrase when I was selling you something. Because if you're not listening, doesn't matter what I say to you. When I had that experience about 18 months ago, like everybody else in the world, I upgraded my broadband, spoke to somebody at BT, and she was great. And then she flogged me a whole mobile package for the whole family. Even though it doesn't work very well in our house, but we'll move on. I'll forgive it that. But the call was really positive, and we got 3/4 of the way through, and she non-verbally said, and this is the bit you don't have to listen to. And I knew I didn't have to listen, because for 2 minutes, she was going, wah, wah, wah. She'd have said it worked perfect, and she passed her compliance score, but I wasn't listening. Like, I remember last time I got a insurance renewal, back in the old days when you used to get them in the post, it got to the stage where I'd look for those, is it key facts statements that the FCA would make financial services firms provide? And the reason I'd look for that is because, unlike most things, it was printed one-sided. So it's really good to use for your shopping list. So I remember literally pulling that out of the envelope, everything else in the recycling, because I couldn't write on the reverse. It doesn't mean anything. That's not outcomes. That's just going through a process. So yeah, in fact, get rid of all that stuff. I
think it's true. It's super true that somebody puts a contract in front of me, I'll just look at it and I'll try and ascertain if there's anything I can quickly find out from looking at it without going into too much depth, because I don't understand legalese. I'm not stupid by any means. Well, people would disagree, but like I can't make head and a tail of legalese, and like I could read it, but I wouldn't have anything come out of that. And if I had any questions, who would I go to and ask them? Because guarantee if I phoned up customer services and went, oh, paragraph 3 of your contract, it says this. Clarify what that means. Can you imagine being the agent on the other side of that? Because I can't. That would be horrendous. And like realistic, we should be able to, but like that's never trained to the agents or anything like that. And more to the point, like we shouldn't have to call up and like I think there's a lot more work needs to be done, is what I'm trying to say, in terms of terms and conditions across the board. And I think we've come some way towards it. I still think there's a long way to go before your average Joe understands even just the terms and conditions on their new TV when they turn on their smart TV and it's updated and you can't view anything until you've agreed to terms and conditions.
Yeah.
So you're saying I can't use my TV unless I agree to terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions generally say we're going to put your data everywhere, and you have to agree to it, otherwise you can't watch the TV. I didn't agree to that when I paid £1,000 for the TV. Which cycles us back around nice.
Sorry, it reads a privacy policy. It reads privacy policies. I mean, even I don't really, and I should be, because I should be interested in them, but I'm not.
We haven't got enough time in the day. Cycles us back around to. There's been a couple of conversations, a couple of messages in the LinkedIn chat there from Bev and Marianne. Hi guys, and they kind of link in together. So I'm gonna bring them both together without putting either up on the screen, but. Kind of what Marianne's saying is there's a lot of talk about data. Not enough focus on sensitive data. So companies all over the world that send information, and I've seen this many times, where they're sending it by general email or through email portals, relatively easy to come under fire from cybersecurity problems. And that links into Bev's point around we should be more worried about where our data could end up, like the dark web. So like, I mean, if I'm fair, I don't think a lot of my information that I've got out there is deeply fascinating for other people. If like my brother refuses to use WhatsApp because he's worried that everybody's going to hack his WhatsApp account. I'm like, well, somebody wants to know what I'm sending my missus for the shopping list that she's out at the shops. She's asking me whether we've got enough milk in the house. Brilliant. Go for hacking that and see what you can do with it. But like to Marianne's point though, I have had businesses email me quite confidential information, unencrypted, unpassword protected, in a PDF on an email. And I know how easy it is to get hold of people's emails. Why is it acceptable for that to happen? And yet we've got this massive focus internally on GDPR.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So about, again, showing my age, a good 15 years ago, I got a job doing something I hadn't done for 10 years, which has been an account manager for an outsourcer, in effect, on a kind of temporary basis. And I was working with lots of people in agencies who were a lot younger than me, so certainly under 30. And they were all emailing spreadsheets with personal data in. And even I, dinosaur that I was, went, you're not meant to do this. At least password protect it, even though 14-year-olds break the password. And there are clearly more secure ways of transferring data. But I think it's just sort of culture. I think it's culture within the organization. In the same way that and I'm going off a slight tangent here, and it's not really about data, but the ASA, Data Science and Standards Association, as was constantly banning ads, particularly on Insta, because they're not um, influencers aren't making it clear that it's a paid advert. Probably, you probably should be able to
Yeah.
guess. And it's because even agencies just aren't schooled on what you think is quite basic stuff. And I think the treatment of personal data, actually, again, it's that GDPR factor. It's like GDPR. Well, what does that mean? And there was a stage, and I think you made this point that, 4 or 5 years ago, people were trying to teach, frontline customer service people who are highly skilled and have a massive cognitive load and hold loads of stuff in their head. We're trying to make them into data privacy lawyers, and they're not. And who would want to? And that's not appropriate. But you do need that kind of interim level, which is, what is this? It's personal data. That's particularly important personal data. You don't want to be sharing that around. And I think it's just sort of basic culture. And I think that's, you can spread that quite easily across an organization. But you're right, it's not going to get you to sort of the pinnacle of the most tricky questions. But I think it's those kind of data hygiene, I guess. And, minimizing retention is a good mantra, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think when I think back, you've probably got more or less two extreme pots of businesses out there. You've got the businesses that are a lot more liberal with their application of any rules and governance. And then you've got the businesses that go to the opposite end and drive people the other way, I think almost by accident. I've been there and sat through the same one. You must memorize this, and you must have this law, and you must know this article, and you must, and then move to a different business. And they're like, oh, yeah, you don't need to do that. Oh, but I thought it was the law. I thought it was GDPR. Well, no, GDPR has just been applied wrongly there. Well, who's right then? So now I've got no trust in GDPR, and I'm just going to do my own thing based on what I think is common sense. And I think that's genuinely where a lot of things.
Yeah. And that's not a bad way to be, really. And also you get the other thing, I go into organizations all the time where it's so complex to use the CRM. People go, well, rather than actually think about how to improve the usage of this tool, I'll just keep a spreadsheet locally. And people have spreadsheets locally. The whole world's full of workplace spreadsheets that shouldn't exist, full of personal and or sensitive data. So, and a lot of it is just understanding those concepts, which I think a lot of people don't. And maybe a little bit is because the way big tech works, none of us, I don't think, trust the big tech platforms, particularly those that are involved in advertising, irrespective of what's happened to the share price. So there's a great deal of sort of cynicism, which is, well, what does it matter? It's all out there anyway. But I think maybe it's a little bit of personal responsibility. Make sure you're not contributing to it, even on your little spreadsheet that's shared on your desktop.
Yeah, that's absolutely fair.
The bigger pictures is a tricky one.
Yeah, well, I think as a country, we're probably moving in the right direction. Whether we're moving fast enough for people's comfort zones and to be doing the right thing is a different question. But I guess that's probably a show for another day, all in itself. So as I said, what happened, Steve? We've got to 30 minutes, and it felt like 10 minutes had passed since we started. So,
but that's a good one. Well, there's one for another day. Is when people are perhaps implementing things like TMAC, is what do you need to think about? So it's not a bolt-on thinking about compliance as you go through the process. So that's something we could do. That, couldn't we? We get half an hour out of that.
Fantastic! It's been great to have you on, Steve. Hope you enjoyed the show. And everybody who's watching at home. Next week we're at the Call and Contact Center Expo. I don't know if you're there, Steve, but if you are, I'll see you there for a coffee. There will be a queue of people going around the block from stand CCJ82. That all owe me a copy, and then there'll be another queue of people going around the other way that I owe a copy on a beer too. So no doubt I will see everybody there for our big rebranding exercise. Can't tell you anything more than that at this moment in time, but it's going to be interesting.